My name is Pia Arboleda, Interim Director of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies. I would like to welcome you to the book talk entitled Emplacing East Timor, Regime Change and Knowledge Production, 1860 to 2010. Our moderator for today, a Swiss-born American-bred Japanese working in the field of comparative politics and Southeast Asian politics. His research interests lie at the nexus of political change and Southeast Asian politics. His book manuscript entitled Provincial Proliferation, Territorial Politics in Post-Suharto Indonesia explores the changing dynamics of territoriality after the fall of authoritarianism and the rise of democracy and decentralization in Indonesia. Our moderator today is Professor Ehito Kimura, our rock star from the Department of Political Science at University of Hawaii at Mānoa. Professor Ehito, I turn the webinar over to you. Mahalo.
All right. Thank you, Pia. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for being our fearless director here at the center. And thank you everyone for coming today to our book talk. My name, again, is Ehito Kimura. I'm a faculty member in political science. I'm also on the executive board of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies here, and I will be the moderator. I want to give a shout out to the Center for Southeast Asian Studies and the staff for doing all of the hard work of organizing the event today. You received all the emails, the RSVPs, and the people behind this Zoom. Those are all our staff members, including our graduate student assistants. So thank you for that. I also just want to give a quick shout out and recognize the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at Kyoto University, where our guest is from today. It's a truly amazing and path-breaking institution. They do an amazing amount of really deep empirical, but also inter and multidisciplinary research around Southeast Asia. And I think our speaker today very much embodies that kind of research. And I want to give a final shout out to the University of Hawaii Press, who published the book today that's going to be talked about. They have an amazing catalog of scholarship and work on Southeast Asia, on Asia and the Pacific and beyond. And just so you all know, that you can purchase today's book from the University of Hawaii Press. There's going to be a link in the chat, and you can get a 30% discount if you use the code AAS 2025. So please, anytime during our time today, go ahead and click that link. Okay, so let me move to my introductions. We're going to have today Professor Kisho Tsuchiya talk about his recent book, and Ariel Mota-Alves offer his thoughts as a discussant. So I'm going to introduce Ariel first before Dr. Tsuchiya. Our discussant, Ariel Mota-Alves, is a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science at the University of Hawaii at Mānoa, and his dissertation research examines the politics of carbon offsetting in rural Timor-Leste and its implications for land access and the livelihoods of smallholder farmers. And he's a student affiliate here at the East-West Center. He's a native Timorese, born and raised in Dili. So he's going to be giving the discussion remarks. But our main speaker today is Dr. Kisho Tsuchiya. He is an assistant professor at the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at Kyoto University. He graduated from the Department of Global Politics, Faculty of Law at Hosei University in 2011, and he worked for the United Nations Election Support Team in Timor-Leste, and then he earned a master's degree in Southeast Asian Studies in 2013 before moving on to a PhD in history in 2018, both from the National University of Singapore. He is a historian and a Southeast Asian area studies scholar, and he has a lot of specialties and interests in colonialism, Cold War, race and ethnicity, social welfare, place and space, borderlands, identity politics, community formation, religious transformation, human rights, and multiculturalism. He's also an editorial board member of the Southeast Asian Studies Journal at Kyoto University and Dialogos at the National University of East Timor, and a member of the Asian Studies Association's Indonesia and East Timor Studies Group, the IETLSC. I also want to just note that he has been an award winner of the Patana Tiasara Paper Prize and also the ITLSC Student Paper Prize in 2017 and 2018, and most recently has been recognized and will be the recipient of this year's Miura Kaiun Research Award for the humanities and social sciences. So as a matter of procedure, we're going to give Dr. Tsuchiya about 30 or 30 plus minutes for his presentation. We'll then move to our discussant, Ariel. We'll give him about 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll move into a guided Q&A session. So without any further ado, please help me welcome Dr. Kisho Tsuchiya.
Professor Kimura, thank you so much for such a comprehensive introduction. And thank you everybody for coming and attending my book talk. I'm very happy that today we have a lot of attendance. And also thank you so much for University of Hawaii for preparing such a prestige, such a, how you call it, a big event for me. I'm very happy to talk to you today. Perhaps I should say thank you to University of Hawaii Press as well. I'm very happy with the product, the book itself. I think it was here. Copy editing is very nice. Well, let me share my slides. Perhaps I should start talking more about something more substantial. Okay. Do you see it? Okay. So the book I published last year is titled Emplacing East Timor, Regime Change and Knowledge Production, 1860 to 2010. It's published from, again, University of Hawaii Press. So I'm very happy to talk to you today for University of Hawaii. Actually, Kimura sensei introduced me very comprehensively, so I have not much to add, but perhaps I should say that before I started my research, I was serving as a UN officer in Timor-Leste, and it was a kind of foundational experience for me to embark for this research about Timorese history. And after the publication of this book, Emplacing East Timor, I'm currently doing oral history research in Mindanao in the Philippines since 2019. But I do not talk much about the Philippines today. So this is the book. In my view, there are four major components in any good book. First of all, characters. The main characters of my book are grassroots intellectuals of many countries and many occupations. Some of them are Portuguese colonial officers, others are Dutch scholars, Australian activists, some are Japanese soldiers, Timorese poets, and revolutionaries. But I'm focusing more on less famous and not internationally recognized intellectuals, but somehow contributed to how we understand this country, Timor-Leste, and contributed to the entire debate about Timorese-ness or how we understand the history of the country. And secondly, story. It's a history about many ways of being East Timorese. It has 9 chapters about war, regime change, and knowledge producers. The worldview of this book is really about changing perceptions of place and space in the cycle of war and stability in modern East Timorese history. And the main theme of this book is it's a critical appraisal, some say deconstruction of knowledge about East Timor in several countries, and an attempt to establish an alternative historical narrative. Sorry, I didn't change it into English, but East Timor is in Southeast Asia. It's north of Australia and eastern side of Indonesia. If you look at it from Japan and the Philippines, it's located at the south. And the island is currently divided into two territories. The western side is part of Indonesia today. We call it Indonesian West Timor. And eastern side is now called Timor-Leste. And they also have an enclave called Oikusi. This is also an East Timorese territory. And this boundary is a Dutch-Portuguese agreement about territorial division. Here are some key concepts and ideas in the book. First of all, place is a space that is meaningful for humankind. But the same place has different meanings for different groups of people. Palestine is a very good example. It's a very contested place, and the place means something different for indigenous Palestinian people and the Israelites. We can see similar things in regard to Timor as well. And I often use this word, emplacing. I mean to say by this word the human activities and expressions that give meanings to a place by locating or situating it in certain regional ideas and world orders. That can be race, cultural zones, trade routes, sovereign territory, citizenship, and so forth. And I often talk about community of interpretation. It is a community of people who interpret a subject matter or a topic. In my case, it is Timor, the communities of people who talk about Timor. And we can see this through knowledge producers' practice of cross-referencing or borrowing ideas without actually citing their works and so forth. When I started this research, I had several questions and aims to write it. First of all, I had a question like this. There are many primary and secondary sources on Timor Island, but why is it described as a new field that is understudied? And I already had a tentative answer by the time I started the research that there was a lack of due attention for non-English sources. So the first aim of the book was to establish a more integrated historical narrative of Timorese history. Secondly, there are huge discrepancies between regarding the images of the Timorese in different language sources and ages, and why and how such images were created. So second aim was to reveal the historical processes of emplacing East Timor in various scales and world orders. The third question was, what are the long-standing factors and patterns that have characterized Timorese history and politics? Despite the diversity of discourses and different views about Timor, there are some continuities in the ways they talk about Timor. So I wanted to identify some patterns and long-standing factors in Timor Island history. It's been nearly 1 year since the publication, so I got quite some comments by other academics. Some reviews are coming in next half a year or so. That's what I heard from some journals. We had a workshop on this book in Yogyakarta in July last year. 6 international academics participated and they made comments on the book. For example, Marisa Gonçalves and Josh Trindade described this book as a triangulation of existing historical narratives by means of various language sources. Especially the book added some Japanese and Chinese sources to the academic knowledge about Timor. And Vanessa Hieman also described this book as a book about many ways of being Timorese. I think this description is quite accurate. And David Webster said that this book deconstructs the transnational activist narrative and establishes a new Southeast Asia-based periodization about the island. Ivo Gonçalves was apparently more critical of the book. He said it's so far the most comprehensive intellectual history of modern East Timor, but there are some important omissions. For example, I didn't talk much about Indonesian educated students' resistance against Indonesia. So he said it raises more questions. Recently, in an interview, Mavero described the book as an analysis of how Timorese poets talked about being Timorese. Grammatically wrong, sorry. So this is a structure of today's talk. I'd like to talk about my motivation first. For example, how I encountered Timor-Leste, East Timor studies, and what inspired me to write this kind of book. And I also want to talk about themes like interrelations of war, regime change, and changing understanding of East Timor, and the worldview of the book, like contemporary relevance and long-term factors that characterize Timorese history and politics. But I do not talk much about the characters and story of the book because I don't want to give too much spoilers. But the book itself talk more about individual historical figures' stories rather than the themes I will be talking about today. So let me start with my encounter with Timor-Leste. So this is what I was told before I became a UN officer in Timor. So there were already some books about independence movement of Timor-Leste, and those historians said that East Timor restored independence after 5 centuries of Portuguese domination, 24 years of Indonesian illegal occupation, and 3 years of UN interim administration. It was after the independence of East Timor, so some of them presented the East Timor problem as a settled case because they assumed the main problem was Indonesian occupation. And they periodized the history based on shifting external rules like Portuguese period, Indonesian, the United Nations, then independent East Timor. And in their writings, usually Indonesia and to a lesser degree Portugal were depicted as villains. And gradually I found out that these were written by people who belong to a community of activists, transnational activist writers who contributed to the movement, human rights movement. My sojourn in Timor-Leste gave me a slightly different impressions. I worked at the UN office in Timor-Leste from 2009 to 10. I also visited Timor-Leste for study trips 2 times before becoming a UN officer, but it was after the crisis in 2006. By 2002, the official view was that Timor-Leste became independent. So many said it's a settled case. But after that, there was a crisis, Timorese people fighting against one another in 2006. So resistance leader and president at the time, Shanana Gusmao, and my teacher and former UN representative in Timor-Leste, Sukehiro Hasegawa, started questioning like, why did Timorese people end up killing each other? Some of the Timorese state officials told us students that the problem is the culture of violence. But I was not much convinced with this idea of culture of violence. And so I started questioning, like, was it really the culture of violence, or is there some historical context or not? Also, I had local experiences that changed my view about Timor-Leste. First of all, when I started working there, there was still a resistance for independence from the UN and Australia. Although official view was that Timor-Leste was independent, there were still thousands of UN troops there, and there were Timorese veterans who considered Timor-Leste as still under occupation or neo-colonial situation. So I began to see the UN as a kind of a new colonial powers, although myself was a UN officer. And I also see that there was a gap between different generations of Timorese people and men and women in regard to how they understand the recent history. So I also started questioning what exactly was independence for East Timorese people. I was fortunate that my UN boss and thesis advisors were encouraging me to read sources that are not only English, Timorese languages, European and Japanese sources. And I found that there were relatively forgotten but high quality colonial scholarship that Anglophone academics do not refer to. And when I started reading about Japanese sources on Timor, I realized that how Japanese viewed Timor was quite different from European observers because they have these colored sensibilities of Southeast Asian countries. Timor was still viewed as a colonial society when Portuguese people considered it as already decolonized. So I began to see these different academic traditions as a kind of multiverse of East Timor studies. So yeah. And in the field of Southeast Asian history, there are works like Tonchai Winichakun's Siam Map and Penny Edwards' Cambodge. These are essentially an intellectual history that traces the making of nationhood in the minds of Thai people and Cambodian people. They had big influence on me. And in Japanese studies, because I'm a Japanese, I also had certain knowledge of Japanese studies. And this early work of Eiji Oguma kind of led me to question about some of the basic ideas about Timorese nationhood by means of historical and sociological methodologies. And in NUS, where I did master's and PhD, there were a group of historians who started questioning epistemological issues in the writing of Southeast Asian history, such as Maitreyi Antwin, Reynaldo Ileto, Takamichi Serizawa, and the last one, Thearatun, belongs to my generation. So those people are writing about what are the potential problems in the existing writing about Southeast Asia. So this kind of community also shaped my way of questioning the history of nationhood. Okay, finally, I'll talk about the content of the book. I'd like to review prevailing views of war in modern Timorese history and my contentions. I tried to gather some of the pictures that have been influential in producing the images about Timor. The one to the left side is a cover of a book written by a Portuguese governor, Teofilio Duarte. The Timorese is depicted as a headhunter. You can see the heads of the enemies lying on around the foot of this guy. wearing traditional clothes and a sword. This was written just after the Portuguese colonial war. That was actually a very devastating war. I will talk about it later. And this type of image of violent Timorese monopoly, monarchy, and belligerent, this kind of images were produced during the time when Portuguese seriously invaded the island. And the picture to the bottom is my book cover. It's similar to the first one, but I made it my book cover because it also captures the colonial social relations there. Portuguese soldiers are looking at the Timorese guy and the cameraman. And you can also see a Timorese boy wearing 1960 Portuguese style clothes here. So it shows a kind of social environment where the image of traditional Timorese were created. And to the right side, you can see starving children. It was taken around the time of famine in late 1970s when Indonesian invasion was the international concern about Timor-Leste. And these two are famous resistance leaders, Shanana Gusmao and Taur Matan Ruak. If you start gathering information about Timor, you tend to collect images that about Timorese masculinity, violence, and victimization. In this slide, I try to put the main findings of my book into one slide. So how people emplace Timorese in different ages. And these are some of the examples. From 1860s to the 1930s, the dominant paradigm was race. It was a time of late colonial rule, and people like Governor Afonso de Castro and physical anthropologist Antonio Mendes Correa described Timorese as Malay or Indonesian. They described Timorese as warlike race, deeply divided. But they also said Portuguese influence are limited because their settlements are limited to coastal areas, only towards the northern side. And we should remember that such image of Timorese was made during the time of colonial war. A Wallace, British traveler and researcher, described the Timorese as Papuans based on his impressions gathered by walking around, looking at the people there. And Forbes, another naturalist, visited Timor in 1880s, described Timorese as a mixed race. But although there are different views about Timor, their concerns were mostly about racial categorizations. And I'd argue that such way of looking at Timorese reinforced colonialism, the politics of colonialism and their epistemology. From 1940s to early 1970s, different ways of looking at Timorese people emerged because there was a rise of anti-colonialism internationally and Portuguese multiracialism as a reaction to rising Asian and African nationalism. During the World War II, Japanese tried to describe Timorese as Asian. Although Japanese were the occupier, they kind of present their relations with the Timorese as one based on friendship and racial affinity, while Australians emphasized that it was a shared war of Australians and Timorese against the Japanese. Of course, Japanese lost and Allied forces won. So during the post-war period, Australian and returning Portuguese perceptions became the dominant paradigm again. But the Portuguese residents in Timor were so terrified because a lot of white Portuguese people died during the war because of Timorese rebellions. So they started talking about loyal Timorese people who helped Portuguese during the war, and also traitors who supported Japanese or in earlier period Australians to kind of disrupt the colonial order. And through this kind of discussions, a new image of Timorese as Portuguese emerged. And from early 1950s, Portugal as an entire nation started emphasizing multiracialism. Those Africans, Chinese, Timorese, they are different from Europeans, but they are also Portuguese. This kind of discourse became dominant in Portugal. By 1960s, Timorese intellectuals also reacted to such Portuguese epistemic change. So he described Timorese as new Portuguese, people who newly became Portuguese because of Portuguese political change, imagining Timor as a part of new Portuguese community. From 1970s to 2010, situation changes again because of Portugal's decolonization attempt at Timor-Leste and also Indonesian invasion. So new paradigm of victimization and resistance against Indonesia emerged during this period. Australian journalist Jill Joliffe described the Timorese as Papuan again, or similar to Australian Aborigine, implying they are not Indonesian or Malay. Interestingly, those activists who worked for human rights and self-determination of East Timorese revisited earlier racist science to defend the cause of East Timor against Indonesia. They also said Timor is more Portuguese civilization than Indonesian. Another way to differentiate Timorese from Indonesia. On the other hand, there were other Timorese people who emphasized the notion of united Timor. This notion itself has a very long history from pre-colonial time during the Japanese occupation. This type of understanding were kind of fastened by pro-Indonesian parties at the time. Yeah, so in the time of Indonesian occupation, different discourses emerged, but the image of Timorese as victims became widespread in the international discussions about the country. And Timorese thinkers and political leaders also tried to formulate ideas about their new nation during the time of Indonesian invasion. So how have such perceptions of the Timorese been shaped by their environment and power relations? I argue that it has something to do with the cycle of war and regime change in this island in the past 160 years or so. I argue that the Manofahi War, the Portuguese colonial war, the World War II, and Indonesian invasion were essentially very similar wars. First of all of them caused massive population loss. During and after the Manofahi War, there was a population loss of 32 to 44%, according to French historian. And World War II caused population loss of 10 to 15%. Indonesian invasion, according to the most up-to-date research, the deaths and starvation resulted in more than 20% of Timorese people's deaths and emigration. All of these were indigenized war. When Portuguese invaded Timor, they relied on coastal Timorese to invade the interior. When Allied forces and Japanese invaded Portuguese Timor, they also relied on Timorese population to fight against one another. And Indonesians too, when they invaded Timor, they trained some Timorese people in Western Timor and then invaded Timor. So although these were foreign invasions, it also involved war between different Timorese groups. There's also another commonality like cross-border dynamics. Mānoa War displaced a lot of Timorese people in the Portuguese territory to the Dutch side. And those people who are in the Dutch side came back to Portuguese Timor during the World War II to help Japanese and re-establish their communities within Portuguese territory. Similar things happened during the Indonesian invasion, like Western Timorese, actually from East Timor, helped pro-Indonesian parties and so forth. And also during the post-1999 consolidation period, a lot of returnees from Portugal, Australia, and other places came back to independent Timor-Leste and became political leaders, administrators, and so forth. So there's a continuing dynamics like that. Although these wars were very similar, different narratives and effects emerged. Why? First of all, Mānoa War was a war between Portuguese and the indigenous populations. There were no foreign journalists at the time in the territory, so the archives are very silent. Officially, Portuguese didn't talk anything about this war. Only secret documents remain. So the dominant discourse about this war and how it's memorized is so influenced by how Portuguese silenced other voices. There's one alternative voice by a French historian, René Pelletier, who wrote a huge book about Portuguese pacification war of Timor. This is an excellent work, so if you can read Portuguese, I suggest you read this book, or French. And when it comes to World War II, the archival documents are abundant, but they are scattered in different countries like Australia, Japan, Portugal, and Timor-Leste itself. The victors were the Allied forces and the Portuguese, and the losers were Japanese and Japanese collaborators. So during the post-war period, the dominant discourses were influenced more by Australian and Portuguese experience of the war. If you read those documents, however, Portuguese contemporary sources, Timorese memoirs, and Japanese written sources, you find quite a different view about the war. It was not only shared war of Australians and Timorese against the Japanese. There were a lot of complex dynamics going on. I wrote a chapter on this period, so if you have a chance to read the book, please look at it. They say my chapter on World War II is the best in the book. I'm not very sure, but they say so. And during the Indonesian invasion, a lot of foreign activists wrote about this situation from the perspective of human rights violation. So there are a lot of sources and documents. Because East Timor became independent in 2002, now their paradigm became the dominant one. And it has a little bit of frictions with Timorese official view, alternative Timorese views about the situations in during the Indonesian period and how they want to narrate their history. So what I want to say here through this book is that there's a constructed nature in how we understand the country and also its history. And it's so much influenced by the nature of the war and how they ended. But if you look at the nature of those wars, they were actually quite similar. Now, are there deeper patterns in modern Timorese history beyond those discourses created by earlier writers or not? So probably I can say this, that I'm the first historian who attempted to integrate Timorese, Portuguese, English, and Japanese sources to reconstruct longer modern East Timorese history. So what might integration of previously separate knowledges tell about the features and the structure of Timorese history? For me, there seems to be a generational cycle of conflict, regime change, relative stability, and at the same time deepening of social tension, then conflict again, rather than just war and peace brought by external intervention. There might be an internal rhythm like that. What are the factors that characterize the pattern of violent regime change in Timor Island? First of all, there's a long durée dynamics of geoeconomics, geopolitics. Timor is a relatively low technologically productive area in relation to Java, mainland Southeast Asia, as well as China. So they depended on imported weapons and technologies when it comes to their economies and politics. It have been a part of trade routes between Australia to China, North and South trade, and Spice Islands and Straits of Malacca, East and West trade. And if you look at the topography of Timor Island, it's actually an island that has a lot of mountainous areas. So the narrow lowland are like contact zones. They have been the centers of secular politics based on the advantage in trade. If you look at the centers of Timorese politics like Wehari, Dili, Oikusi, they are all coastal communities. But there's a vast upland in this island, so there are relatively small but ritually important polities, and they have a strong tendency toward communal independence. And violence was never monopolized by the state because of these high mountainous areas. And this can be considered as a continuity from early colonial period to our time. And the border on the island also influenced the long-term pattern. We can describe this as a situation of two jurisdictions and loose border control. It's similar to Hong Kong, parts of Mindanao, and Rakhine State in Myanmar. This situation of two jurisdictions and loose border control encourages migration of criminals and political dissidents between two territories. So in the long run, there was a growth of diasporic communities in both sides of the border. So when there was an external prompt of war and conflict, there have always been local competitions and diasporic communities' desire to go back. So these functioned as destabilizing factors for the long-term Timorese history. This is the final slide, I guess. So the book is, first of all, a historical drama about grassroots knowledge producers, through which many ways of being East Timorese emerge. I didn't talk much about this, But there are a lot of fascinating historical figures in this story. Um, and it's also a historical analysis of political patterns for academic people, of course. And it's also a critical appraisal of knowledge producers. Um, Not everybody is very famous internationally, but I wanted to pay respect for those local academics in Portugal, Australia, Japan, and Timor, Indonesia, who paid serious attention to Timor Island. Thank you for listening. I think I should end here. Stop
All right. Thank you
there.
very much, Tsuchiya Sensei, for that presentation and talking about both your sort of personal motivations going into the research and then touching on a lot of the themes that come out in the book. And this is the moment when people can start thinking about the questions that they want to pose to the professor. You can put them in the Q&A box, but I do want to give the floor over to Ariel to offer a few words of reflection.
All right. Thank you, Professor Kimura, and thank you, Dr. Tsuchiya, for excellent presentation. It really summarized the book. I just finished reading it last night. The last chapter, it is really, really well written. Like you were saying, it's a historiography um, that follows the genealogy of the construction of East Timor, and Timorese spatial imaginings. Um, I want to begin with a few comments and end with a question. But I think, the book does a really good job in challenging the East Timor political and spatial imaginings that is often rooted in nationalist struggles and the heroic struggle for independence, right? And it is a great critique to the mainstream studies of East Timor that is framed as promotion of territorial unit, right? Like you prefaced that in your introduction, and how your when I was reading this book, I read this as how it challenges like the notion of nation states of East Timor, which is a more modern concept, modern invention that often ignores the rich and long shared cultural history and history of civilization that existed in the island of Timor for a long time. Um, and it dealing with construction of identities and how it is changing over time depending on who construct it, right? It's like an ambiguous identity of Timor-Leste. And I think this is still very much relevant in today's Timor-Leste, right? Like our East Timorese, when you meet people in the Pacific and in Asian countries, right? Like they know exactly who they are. Like we're Thai, we're Indonesians, and we're Southeast Asians. But like for Timorese to say that Timorese people are Southeast Asian, it is a bit tricky, right? Like that the idea that whether Timorese people are Asian or they're Pacific, right? And then they're Malay, Polynesian, like you were saying in the book, and like, and also the special um, connection that they have in the past, like you were. I just learned about how like there are different imaginings of how Timor was used to be the tributary of Majapahit. Um, but it is really a great book that provides new and fresh interpretation of construction national identity and political identity of East Timor. It is very unique. I don't think many Timorese, at least in my generation, is aware of this type of history. One of my favorite early memory of understanding of nationhood is when I started primary school, which was, like really in the beginning of um, after the independence, right, after 2002, and like my cohort and the cohort after me were really the first the first generation after the independence that learn about this new country. And I remember how, like in our art class, when we have to draw the map of East Timor, because our teachers want us to know about this new nation that we're part of, right? And where we were really good at drawing the administrative boundaries of the 13 municipalities that make up the East Timor today. But if you ask the primary school kids to draw the West Timor, the Kupan, like they wouldn't know how to do that, right? Because when we draw East Timor, we don't really imagine about the West Timor, the whole, even though both share the whole island, right? Like how we never think about the whole island, but just one of, but the half of the island and the enclave. I think overall it is really an excellent contribution to the studies of nationalism, right, as a constructed concept, right? Like you reference um, Tonchai, Siam Map, and also Benedict Anderson and Imagine Communities, right? So, and the fact that you develop new way of understanding East Timorese identity and how East Timorese identity is not necessarily is not immune to this construction, suffer from uh, constructed identity as a constructed concept. Um, it is again, like I said earlier, very rich historiography, provides genealogy of construction Timorese identity, uh, like written by colonial historians, anthropologists, colonial officers, shaped by the backdrop of Cold War and decolonization, Timorese activists, the Fretilin and the old generation, right? Um, let's see. When I was reading this, I was curious how if this book, I don't know, I'm curious if you've given this book to some of the veterans to read, but I imagine they might find some of the things um, that you write are really hard to accept, right? Like especially how it seems to me that you are not really sympathetic to the uh, like nationalist struggle for independence, right? Um, and um, I also learned new things about, for example, Fernando Silva. And that says something that, like how a lot of us were not really exposed to, other writers of writers of nationalism, other than obviously Sanana and Borja da Costa. But the fact that you equate them, Fernando Silva, to you said that Fernando Silva is a nationalist similar to Sanana and Francisco Borja da Costa. I think that can be controversial, but and other last thing I find really striking is how you empathize with what you call boycotters, like the RDTL, Sagrada Familia, KRM, right? And like this is exactly how everyone sees them, right? Like that they're boycotters of the construction of nationhood, that they're causing obstacles to the nation. And like the fact that UN officers, your colleagues, are saying that they're traitors, that's exactly how everyone like I guess not everyone, like most people see them, right? But the fact that you empathize, it really shines a new light about how the idea of nationhood is can be disputed, right? Like especially with the UN being in East Timor for 10 years and like implementing the new liberal agenda. So some people see that as not really counterintuitive to uh, the idea of independence. So I guess I will end here. I'll leave you with a question, maybe like two. How do you see the legacies of past spatial and political imaginings, right? So that's during the construction of native identity. Sorry, my computer is acting up. Um, native identity by colonial historians, World War II, Cold War, decolonization, and then Fretilin. How do these continue to shape or frustrate the contemporary Timorese state efforts to construct a unified national identity and govern a territorially, historically, and culturally diverse Timor-Leste, and what continuities do you see? And then my second question is, what is so bad about post-Fretilin nationalist political imagining when it was so crucial for Timor-Leste self-determination? Thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Hi, Ariel. Thank you so much for your comments. There are many interesting stuff in your comment and questions. Maybe I can start with some minor points. You mentioned 30 municipalities, right? So you studied it in primary school, yeah? Did they tell you that this unit was based on Portuguese military barracks?
No, we were just supposed to know how to draw the boundaries correctly. So like Lauten
I
and
see.
Baucau and Viqueque and Mantutu. So like do them in order. But
I see.
yeah.
There are a lot of specialists kind of misunderstand it as a indigenous um, indigenous unit of special divisions, but it's actually based on how Portuguese proceeded from here to there, here to there. They made those barracks in different locations. They started from Dili and Aileu and so forth, gradually. So in the earlier period, there were not 13, but I should have talked about it in the book, but it's really interesting aspect of how space is created by colonial administration, and it becomes national identity. Um, um, well, when it comes to nationalist struggle, um, well, I'm actually quite sympathetic about it, but the thing is, I wanted to go beyond that one. So I felt it's unfair if I do not include a chapter about the resistance against Portugal and Indonesia. So chapter 9 is dedicated really to different notions of nationhood created against um, colonial identities. Um, but I'm only critical of the idea that there's only fixed official national identity. Like you said, there were people like CPD, LDTL, Sagrada Familia, Corimau 2000, actually challenged the independent Timor-Leste after it was considered internationally settled case. Some of them even demanded a creation of another state within Timor-Leste, right? It's kind of very interesting, and I found that okay, I came here to help develop a new state and Timorese country, but I realized that I'm also like a colonial officer to them. And when I started reading Southeast Asian histories, history of other countries like Philippines and Vietnam, and also Japan, I realized that there were similar moments like American occupation of Japan. There was a disruption of historical narratives between the wartime Japan and after the American occupation. American occupation was a very important period for Japanese people. And also Philippines, before and after American occupation are very different, how they understood themselves, how they understand their history. So I was looking at Timor-Leste's UN period in comparison to American occupations, the Japanese and Filipinos experience, because I also have Filipino family in Mindanao. So perhaps this will provide a context for um, why I seem to be very critical of the government notion of nationhood. I'm just saying it's not the only thing. There are different Timorese imagining of nationhood. And when I encountered those people from Sagrada Familia, I was fascinated. There's something genuine in them. I felt, although I was like their enemy. Okay. Then other questions.
Yeah, let me just sort of intervene here. You can answer the other questions that
Ah,
Ariel had about the colonial legacies and things like that. But I also see two questions in the webinar chat, and I'll just sort of read them out. If you'd like to ask your question in person, you can also contact and chat to the tech people, and you can appear and ask your question in person as well. But I'll just mention the two that have appeared so far, and other people who are listening who want to add more questions, we can add them, and we can just kind of continue this as a kind of conversation. But as you can see, the first question is really about the diaspora. It says, I was wondering if you have chapters that incorporate the diasporic experiences of the borderland. For those who became diasporas in Timor, what is their perspective of their identity today? And what is the indigenous Timorese perception of the diaspora's identity? So kind of an interesting take on how the indigenous see the diaspora as well. Is there anything you can share from your research or from your UN experience? And then I'll just jump into the second one and read that as well. And you can sort of take this as it comes. You referred to the generational cycle of conflict, regime change, and relative stability. I'm curious if there are any other countries, societies that display a similar pattern. In what ways is the case of Timor-Leste similar to them, and what makes Timor-Leste a peculiarity? And you already started to talk a little bit about comparison. So I think that's a great question. So please feel free to keep the questions coming. You can use the chat or the Q&A box. But Tsuchiya-san, go ahead.
okay. Then I'll try to answer some of the questions by Ariel and two others. First of all, okay, I'll start from the two others first. Diaspora's identities. It's not fixed kind of identities. Like earlier diasporas, I assume very different from today's diaspora. Like those people who collaborated with the Japanese, they were more interested in going back to Portuguese Timor and re-establish their community, their own reign or kingdom. I wonder whether this is the right word or not, but their communities in Portuguese Timor. That's why they collaborated with the Japanese. And they also had a grudge against those Timorese and Portuguese who kind of chased them away from their communities. So they also wanted to retaliate during the World War II. But more recent period, I see gradual consolidation of national separation. The diasporic groups or former pro-Indonesian people in West Timor, they are trying to be more Indonesian. I'm not very sure about their lives nowadays because I haven't been able to visit there. Ariel might know the experience of Indonesians in Timor-Leste better than me, I guess. I lived there. I met a lot of Indonesian people in Timor. And Timorese people are usually not angry to those civilian Indonesians, like only against the military. And they move between West and East Timor and they do business. And perhaps people from Portugal people who came back from Portugal and Australia are put into different categories in East Timorese mind, I guess, because they tend to be better educated and then tend to be richer. I see some resentments among the Timorese people who are working in Timor against those people. What do you say? Well, you may comment after. Let me say something about the patterns again. And the cycle of generational return of the violence. I see a lot of commonalities with, for example, like I said, Philippines and Japan. In Japan, it didn't become really violent, but the ideas that were suppressed by the American occupation continue to haunt the national debate about, resistance against a treaty, Japan-American treaty, and so forth and so forth. Some of them come back as leftist resistance against the government, sometimes as rightist resistance against the government. But I can see that this return of suppressed sentiments again and again and again in the Philippines as well, when the students revolted against Filipino government and Marcoses in the earlier period. They raised this slogan, unfinished revolution. Right? It's similar to how Timorese people talk about a continuing struggle, luta continua. So we can do a global history of unfinished revolution if you like. And there are a lot of continuities. Some are surprising because I also wanted to see the continuities, because when I went to Timor for the first time, I really didn't understand what's going on and the meanings of all these activities Timorese people are doing. My research was really aimed to understand the meanings of those things, to make sense of what's going on in contemporary Timor-Leste. And I hinted those things in many passing lines in the book. You may look at it. Sometimes I tell my Timorese friends that you need to read it twice to get the entire points. Because sometimes I don't explain everything. I just mention those things in passing lines. But I'm hinting the continuities or the context to our time. Did you say anything about Frederick government? How bad was Frederick's? What is so bad about post-Frederick nationalist political imagining when it comes to? I don't say that they were very, very bad, but the thing is, I don't say that Frederick leaders were incapable in imagining Timorese nationhood. In fact, they were very relevant for the Timorese people, and otherwise they didn't vote for Frederick, right? But the thing is, they were stuck with one version of Frederick ideals held by certain returnee leaders at the time who stayed in other countries. They didn't heed much attentions to the war survivors' experience and how their ideas developed during the 24 years of Indonesian occupation. So I think that was the important context to 2006 crisis, when people felt that Frederick's not heeding their voices. And there have been a lot of popular sentiment about what should the new country be. Many were contradictory, and perhaps by nature of modern sovereign state, it is very difficult to incorporate all these. And I believe that younger generation of Timorese leaders like yourself, you should be more open to such alternative Timorese political thoughts and imaginings. When you study those losers, you can see potentials that did not realize, and there are a lot of hints to how you might change the country. Yeah.
Sounds good. I actually had a couple of questions as we, and again, I invite if there are any other questions that want to come through, either the text or if anyone wants to be put on camera and have a question in person. But I want to follow up on the previous question about generational cycles and ask specifically about the cycle part of it. Because you, and especially in your last chapter, I think you go through kind of these ideas of historical cycles and the ways that which they can be attached to violence. And you also, I think, really nicely kind of ask this question of like, where are we now, right? And I just want to ask, like, when we have these historical cycles, what is your sense about being able to break out of these kinds of cycles, especially when they're attached to things like, like mass violence and things like that? So where are we now? And also, I guess the question of, the future of where are we going?
Okay. This idea of cycle was not in the earlier manuscript of this book, but I wanted to make the argument stronger, and then I decided to elaborate this idea more. And I think I didn't extensively cite the works of Ibn Khaldun and Victor Lieberman, but these two people talked about the cycle of administrative changes and the relations between the state, city-state, and nomads and so forth. I think their works indirectly influenced my book. And in Ibn Khaldun's case, he was talking about the cycle of this, nomad and state relations. And at that time, there was no get away from not get away to I would say overcome this cycle. But now we know that establishing proper democratic state, and you can in some cases you can overcome this vicious cycle of state consolidation and disruption. Perhaps solid democratic state might be one way to alleviate the situation, but I think it's not the only thing. And when it comes to Timor Island, there's a unique situation. It's a small island divided into two, and the border have been very difficult to manage. So now that East Timor is independent, I think it's very important for Timor-Leste to discuss extensively with Indonesia about how to manage this border. And local leaders should also participate in this, like the borderland dwellers of both sides. And I think they are doing this kind of thing slowly, but otherwise, it's very difficult to solve this problem of circular process. And we foreign academics should be also very responsible in what to say about Timor-Leste. Like often, if you look at East Timorese history, the violence was begun by external initiative, like a sudden declaration of Portuguese government saying, let's decolonize Timor-Leste, and when Timorese people are not expecting decolonization, so we should be also very responsible in what to say, what to suggest to Timor-Leste as well. And where am I going? But did I answer your question?
Yeah, I think you did, because I think when you talk about the cycles, and you talked about it in your presentation as well, some things are things that are hard to change, right? Like topography and geography
Yes.
and trade routes and things like that. But borders are things that I mean, they're also difficult to change, but they can also have some degree of control or sort of political resolutions and things like that. So I think part of what you're saying is there are more deterministic factors, but also some factors that are more dynamic and changeable. So it's not an inevitability in some ways.
Yes.
There's another
Excellent.
question here that regarding World War II. It says, regarding World War II, Timorese is learning a great deal from various writings, and it is now in history books of students in primary and secondary schools. Excuse me. And I am interested to know how Japanese children learn about World War II and Japan's role in Timor, how Timor-Leste is being emplaced in Japanese national history teaching.
How Timor-Leste is emplaced in Japanese national history? I see. How should I put it? The Japanese view on Timor-Leste has been changing also. In earlier period, it was not really distinguished from Indonesia. And when they actually invaded in 1940s, it became a big problem because Portugal was a neutral territory, but it was occupied by Allied forces. So Japan didn't really intend to invade Portuguese Timor, but they felt we apparently if we don't go to Portuguese Timor, it kind of and it doesn't make sense because Australians are there, and in Dutch Timor also there are also allied forces. If we leave Portuguese Timor there, doing nothing, it doesn't make sense as a military strategy. That's how Japanese interest in the island started increasing. And in the post-war period, some soldiers and intelligence people who stayed in Timor started writing about memoirs of their stay in Timor. Some of them, although unequal relations, they developed certain intimate relations with Timorese people. So people like Toru Maeda wrote a lot about his relationship, his friendship with Timorese children, and how he was involved in local politics as well. Others wrote about their relationship with Timorese women. Some are quite disturbing. Like some soldiers wrote about how you call it, comfort women. There were a serious abuse by the Japanese soldiers during that period. I wrote a little bit, but I feel that there should be more extensive work on this type of abuse as well. Um, and some Japanese historians wrote a lot about comfort women in Timor, not only Timorese, but also ethnic Chinese there. Um, But by the military strategists, it was written like the occupation of Timor was a success, while Timorese and Australians didn't see it as that way. Why success? Because not many Japanese didn't die there. Many Japanese didn't die because they relied on Timorese warriors. Um,
Right.
so Japanese views on Timor are also very problematic. But when it comes to ordinary people's understanding, they only know basic facts like Japan invaded Timor during the World War II, and there was Indonesian occupation. Some former soldiers became human rights activists. It became independent. Maybe that's all common Japanese people know about Timor-Leste. Recently, there was a new edited book on Timor-Leste written by many Japanese academics and NGO workers. But interest in Timor is generally a little bit declining after the period of peace building there.
You know, if I can, I don't know if Ariel, you have any further questions, but as you talked about your sort of motivation and you talked about, having worked at the UN and your interactions, I'm wondering if people have pressed you on, the commonly asked question about positionality, right? Both in terms of being sort of an outsider Japanese as opposed to, any other number of categories, Portuguese, Indonesian, American, but also being an academic and also being quite young as an academic. And so I don't know if you want to kind of talk a little bit about that and how you think about that as you think about your broader,
Positionality.
yeah.
Well, this is often asked question, and I often say that I was a UN officer because I should reveal how I came to this field. Um, I encountered Timor-Leste through my teacher, Sukehiro Hasegawa. He was actually the representative of the UN in Timor-Leste. So he was like a colonial governor. I mean, to use colonial category, he was like a colonial governor and came to my university to take the responsibility of 2006 crisis. I became interested in those internal affairs because of his trauma about the crisis. So I really came from this context of peace building and so forth. But when I went there, I was the youngest UN officer, and I didn't receive international officer's salary. I was recruited in a very strange way, like receiving the same amount of payment with the national Timorese officers. So I was a kind of target of curiosity among the Timorese officers as well. We had lunch every day together with Timorese people in Warung Barato. I mean, Warung Barato, cheap restaurant. $1 usually, $1 meal. So I kept listening to their complaints about international officers, United Nations every day, and I was kind of, how to put it, I was kind of more brainwashed by Timorese colleagues than by the UN people. That's how I started feeling certain intimacy as well to those Timorese boycotters or national officers who collaborated with the UN and so forth. But nonetheless, I'm still like a foreign academic, a UN officer before, so I'm still a foreigner. I don't have local networks like the Timorese people who actually live there. And if you look at my interest that appear in the book, you might find that the way I look at it is more close to field-based colonial officers or social anthropologists rather than, say, the writers of travelogues or human rights activists. Because I was part of the governance system in Timor-Leste, my concern was everyday political issues rather than the human rights violations by Indonesians. That made me different from earlier generations of foreign academics writing about Timor-Leste.
Yeah. There's a kind of follow-up question from someone who asks, did you learn Tetun? And, that to me leads to this larger question of like, yeah, can you talk a little bit about what languages you did use as you were doing your research and the archives and things like that? Yeah.
Okay, by the time I went to Timor, I was already more or less fluent in English and Japanese. I spent part of my childhood in Indonesia, so I speak Indonesian, baby Indonesian talk. But the first instruction from my UN boss was to learn Tetun, and then if I have time, learn written Portuguese. Because otherwise, he said, you cannot communicate with local people, and you cannot read electoral laws. So, he told me to master basic Tetun and Portuguese in 3 months. So after working in the UN, I went home, studied those grammar books and word books. I went to bars and talked with Timorese people. So after 3-4 months, I was able to converse in Tetun. Most of the time I was talking in Tetun when I was there. Occasionally, I served as a translator between UN officers and Timorese people there. Now my Tetun is becoming rusty because I lived in Singapore almost 10 years after that. And then now I'm in Japan for 3 years more. I don't have much opportunities to use Tetun daily, so I want to brush up my Tetun, but it's enough to read those documents and talk with people. So I use Tetun, Portuguese, English, Japanese. My Dutch is so weak, so I decided to read the French translation of Dutch works. I read a bit of Chinese and Indonesian, but because my Indonesian and Chinese are weak, my investigation was less vigorous in comparison to Portuguese, English, Japanese, and Tetun sources.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one more question. There's a question here asking, how does the foreign perspective of the Timorese people influence the international legitimacy of this newly established state? And I think that has broad comparative interest, but yeah, specifically in the context of Timor-Leste, can you?
What do you say, Ariel? To me, it seems like all those legitimacy come from foreign transnational activists' writings in the 80s and 90s. What do you say? Ariel, are you there?
Oh, sorry. Can you repeat your question?
How does the foreign perspective of the Timorese people influence the international legitimacy of the newly established state? And I think Tsuchiya-san is talking about, the influence of a lot of the transnational activists as well.
I would say that was, Prevailing had there are three wings under Prevailing. One was the diplomatic wing, and they were fighting for foreign solidarity from international solidarity, right? I think for them it was crucial, and it was the only way for Timorese state to gain legitimacy. And I think this continues until now. Like we're trying to, working hard to like create like an image of the state that is ready to join regional organizations like ASEAN, right? Like we're also spearhead, like about G7 plus, but it's a small G, right? Like that's with the post conflict states, right? Like trying to like do good and appear as like being a good ally at the international level. So I would say, yeah, it's very important. It's yeah.
I think we're coming almost on time. So at this point, I want to thank Ariel, but especially Dr. Tsuchiya for having such a fascinating presentation. Again, I encourage everyone to check out the book. It really is fascinating. It's both history and historiography, and I learned an amazing amount. And so with that, I want to turn things over to Teri Skillman, who will close out our session and make some announcements. But thank you, Dr. Tsuchiya.
Thank you so much for moderation, your comment, and attendance.
Thank you, Dr. Tsuchiya. I'm sorry, but I am having trouble turning on my video. So I will just go ahead and be the silent, dark voice. Thank you so much for your research and sharing it with us and taking the time to speak with us from Japan. Also, thank you, Dr. Kimura, for moderating this important book talk, and for Ariel for joining us from Timor-Leste as a discussant. Mahalo to our audience for tuning in, and we ask that you please follow our center's events by signing up for our newsletter on our website. I believe the links are in the chat. Is that correct? Yes, there we go. And on behalf of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Hawai'i at Mānoa, we wish you all well. Please stay safe and check in with us for our next event. Mahalo.